Mr. Pettigrew's teddy bear was somewhat of a legend in my town. Everyone knew Mr. Pettigrew, and everyone knew about the small fluffy teddy bear that he kept in his classroom. I had first-hand experience with the teddy bear when I first attended Montgomery Preschool at the age of 6. I distinctively remember falling in love with the old bear as soon as I had been dropped off on my first day, just like every other kid. I had clung to my mother a lot that morning, first in our front yard, then again in the car, and most obviously, in the doorframe of Mr. Pettigrew's classroom. But once the old teacher had emerged for the first time, laying that soft bear into my arms, it was as though an untouchable safety net had been cast around me, protecting me from all the evil and hurt. Looking back now, I'm unsure of how I warmed to it so much. The teddy bear itself was scruffy and it looked extremely old-fashioned. It was a rusty brown color with a small blue bow drawn on its left ear. Its right ear was always frayed to the point that it was barely even attached, and its mouth was simply an array of zigzags, courtesy of its shoddy sewing. But the worst part were the eyes, or should I say the two wide black buttons recklessly glued onto the face, mimicking eyes. They were far too large in proportion to the toy's actual face, dominating at least a third of its head. And even worse, it always felt as though there was a small red glow resting in one of them, almost as if a demonic presence was simmering within its body. Of course, this didn't bother us much as kids, but the more we discussed it as we grew older, the more unsettling the idea became. Despite this, everyone loved Mr. Pettigrew because of that teddy bear. So it came as a real shock when he passed away on a bitter December morning, only a few years after he had retired. By this time, I was fresh out of college, working as an intern at the Montgomery Police Academy. I specifically remember the moment I had heard the news because I was filing some mind-numbingly boring paperwork for my superior. I had overheard a conversation across the room go a little something like this. "You hear that old Pettigrew bit the bullet this morning? You're kidding me." "Nope, he died in his sleep, that poor sod. Hopefully that awful teddy bear died too." "Don't be horrible, my youngest loved that man. Said he was the kindest teacher she ever had." So that was that. Mr. Pettigrew, Montgomery's finest teacher, had suddenly died in his sleep. The news spread quickly, and that evening, our local news company had even broadcasted a 20-minute segment remembering his immense teaching qualities, his dedication to Montgomery, and his warm heart. It was lovely, really. Although I imagine we would mourn for a couple days max before resuming our lives as normal. But that was not the case. In fact, the death of Mr. Pettigrew would be nestled in our minds for much longer to come. It was only a matter of days after he passed that the first death occurred. Gina Randolph died on the 21st of December. She was found in her bedroom by her parents, her wrist slashed 17 times. The cuts were so deep, they presumed that she had died of blood loss minutes after the first incision. The incident sent shockwaves across the local community. Nobody could even comprehend why a young girl who had everything going for her would just kill herself, only a few days before Christmas. Gina's death was initially reported as a tragedy, just an unforgiving and terribly sad tragedy, and it wasn't even treated as suspicious. But just a few days later on Christmas Eve, it happened again. Lee Salt, a young man who had graduated from law school the previous summer, was found late in the morning, hanging from the doorframe of his bedroom. He had used an old rusty bike chain that had lay forgotten among the junk in his family's old shed at the bottom of their yard. Interesting enough, it was revealed that somebody had desperately tried to break in and enter the shed, evidenced by the broken window and unusual dents in the door. This was taken by the Salt family as clear evidence that Lee didn't kill himself, and that maybe he was murdered. But those suspicions were gently pushed aside and his death was ruled as a suicide, just like Gina's. Some agreed with his parents and petitioned for a curfew in Montgomery based on what his parents had said. Others nastily speculated that Lee was so desperately craving death that he broke into his own shed just so that he could end his life that much quicker. But it wasn't until the third and final death, the day after Christmas Day, that things started to get really strange. Clarissa Brooks had taken her car out late that night, telling her parents that she needed to get gas, but she never returned. Early the next morning, a search party was employed and her body was found a few miles away. Clarissa was found slumped against her car on a small dusty back road behind an isolated woodland area. She had stolen her father's 9.1mm and shot herself in the head 3 times. When she was discovered, her car engine was still chugging slowly. Much to the authorities' surprise, Clarissa had driven in the opposite direction from the closest gas station, and there was nothing in her car that suggested she was trying to run away. However, there was one thing that was recovered from her car, something that would eventually serve as the single most crucial piece of evidence throughout the whole investigation. From inside the passenger side's glove compartment, a small crumpled piece of paper was recovered. Initially, the search party was confused. They simply couldn't understand why Clarissa Brooks had left a blank piece of paper with nothing on it but a small sketch of a small brown teddy bear. The discovery led to a lot of questions, but once a member of the search party joked that Mr. Pettigrew's teddy bear had killed her, an investigation was opened into a potential link between the lovable teacher and Clarissa's tragic death. This ridiculous investigation soon gathered speed until eventually poor Mr. Pettigrew was being blamed for Lee's death. And as well, and sure enough by the new year, he had supposedly killed Gina too. I refused to believe any of it, along with anybody else in Montgomery who had an ounce of decency and self-respect. And so naturally, the case went cold. Of course it did. He was simply a scapegoat. This was until one day in late February when an unidentified person came forward purporting to have crucial information that the police simply had to know about. I overheard in the office one day that it involved critical evidence which would finally reveal the truth about absolutely everything from the beginning to the end, no exceptions. But typically, the name of the person and what they had said was kept strictly confidential from the public. And the situation was no different for police interns like me. And this continued to be the case up until late June, when out of nowhere a meeting of fundamental importance was scheduled by the chief inspector, requiring compulsory attendance with absolutely no exceptions. So on the 23rd of June, the entirety of the Montgomery police force was bundled into one room. The boss, Chief Inspector Saunders, stood up at the front of the room. He cleared his throat as the room breathed in anticipation. "Ladies and gents, for the past few months, we have been in the process of gathering crucial evidence in the case concerning the deaths of Gina Rudolph, Lee Salt, and Clarissa Brooks. We are of course very grateful for your patience and concern. But the evidence we have been subject to is extremely sensitive, and we needed to make sure we had gone through absolutely everything before we jumped to any conclusions." He paused. "My friends, Mr. Pettigrew was not the man many of you had known or heard about. Whether you believe it or not, he was a manipulative, evil, and disgusting man. As you might well recall, back in April, we had a young lady turn up at the station in an emotional wreck. She informed us that he had sexually assaulted her as a child on multiple occasions. A collective gasp filled the room. She told us that she had put her childhood and Mr. Pettigrew behind her, but when she heard his name in the news reports, it all came back to her. She was extremely scared, and she said that she even deliberated for the longest time whether she even believed it herself. This took immense bravery, and since then, we have received many more claims. Currently, there are 54 individuals in the Montgomery area alone who have claimed to be sexually harassed or assaulted by Mr. Pettigrew during their time at Montgomery Preschool, and we believe that list included Miss Rudolph, Miss Brooks, and Mr. Salt. We believe this guilt and suffering became too much for these 3 individuals that when his name was introduced back into their lives, they made the ultimate sacrifice." I was completely mesmerized. There had to be some kind of mistake. I saw a few others shaking their heads towards the front of the room. I think Saunders noticed this because he subsequently turned and nodded at his colleague sitting at the computer. "Show them the tape," The lights were slowly dimmed and an old tape recording began to play on the whiteboard behind him. The rustic recording was flaky and made a light crackling sound, but you could just about see the silhouette of a young child and hear muffled conversation between them and whoever was behind the camera. "How are you today?" "Good." "I hope Mr. Teddy Bear helped you with your math questions earlier." "Yes, thanks, Mr. Teddy Bear." "Good. Mr. Teddy Bear thinks you look very handsome today. He likes your shiny red shoes." "Thanks." "Can Mr. Teddy Bear see what's under your Saunders fumbled for the remote and quickly cut off the tape. As the tape shut off, my mind began to scatter. An overwhelming sense of deja vu lingered in my head. What the fuck? I remembered having that exact conversation. I remembered how Mr. Pettigrew had asked me to stay back at lunch one Thursday because he said I was lonely and I needed a friend. I remember the shiny red shoes that I had begged my mom to buy me only a matter of days before. The awful things that had happened that lunchtime. No. There was no way. How the fuck did he film it? Even at that age, I would have questioned it. I felt sick to my stomach and the room suddenly became a messy haze. I groggily stood up, stumbling to the side, and I eventually collapsed onto the floor. People all around me began to comfort me, asking what was wrong, but I wasn't paying any attention to them. I desperately scanned the room for a door, and that's where my eyes met with a small security camera perched between the wall and the ceiling. A small red glow slowly flickered where the lens was, almost as if a demonic presence was simmering within its body.